The arrival. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina, in Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying. Not dying in the ordinary way, not the slow decline of illness or the aftermath of injury, but dying in a specific and terrible way that those who witnessed it had never seen before. Their bodies were covered in black swellings the size of eggs, in the armpits and the groin and the neck, oozing blood and pus. They were feverish and delirious. They were in agony. And they smelled, the smell reached those on the docks before the ships arrived, a smell of corruption and death that those who encountered it never forgot and could never quite describe. The harbor master of Messina ordered the ships out of the port immediately. The ships left. Some of the sailors were already dead. The ones who were still alive would be dead within days. And in those brief hours while the ships were in the harbor, in the time it took for the harbor master to see what was happening and order them away, the thing that had traveled with the sailors from somewhere to the east had found its way into Messina. Within weeks, people in Messina were dying of the same disease. Within months, it had spread across Sicily. Within a year, it was in France, in Spain, in England, in the Low Countries, moving northward and eastward across Europe with a speed and a completeness that overwhelmed every human attempt to understand it or stop it. This was the Black Death. The worst pandemic in recorded human history. The catastrophe that, in the 5 years from 1347 to 1353, killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population of Europe, estimates vary, and the uncertainty is itself revealing, and left the world it touched permanently transformed. Tonight, I want to take you into that world, into the streets of the medieval cities and the fields of the medieval countryside, into the experience of the people who lived through the plague and the people who did not. I want to tell you what the Black Death was, how it spread, what it did to the human body, and what it did to the human world. Let's begin. The Black Death did not begin in Europe. The best current scientific understanding, based on analysis of ancient DNA from plague victims, is that the pandemic originated in Central Asia, probably in the region around what is now Kyrgyzstan, where the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis had been present in rodent populations for centuries or millennia before it emerged in a virulent form in the mid-14th century. The mechanism by which the plague spread from its Central Asian reservoir to the trading routes that carried it westward is not entirely clear, but the most likely pathway involves the Mongol Empire, the vast political and commercial network that in the mid-14th century connected China and Central Asia to the Middle East and, through the trading ports of the Black Sea, to Europe. A specific event is sometimes cited as the vector by which the plague entered European awareness, the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula, in 1346. A Mongol army besieging the city was afflicted by plague, and according to the Italian notary Gabriele de Massis, writing after the fact, and not necessarily as an eyewitness, the Mongols catapulted their dead over the walls of the city, introducing the disease to the defenders inside. This story has been repeated so often that it has acquired the status of historical fact, but historians are cautious about it. De Massis was not present at Kaffa and was recording what he had heard. The technical feasibility of catapulting corpses as a biological weapon has been debated. And the plague was already spreading widely through the Black Sea region before the siege of Kaffa, so even if the story is accurate, it may not have been the decisive event in the plague's westward journey. What is certain is that by 1347 the disease was present in the ports of the Black Sea, carried by merchants and sailors, and that the ships that reached Messina in October of that year were not the first ships to carry the plague westward, they were simply the ships whose arrival is best documented. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, named for the Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, who identified it during an outbreak in Hong Kong in 1894. Yersinia pestis is primarily a disease of rodents. It circulates among rat and other rodent populations, transmitted by fleas that feed on infected animals and then transmit the bacterium to new hosts. In most circumstances, this cycle remains within the rodent population, with human exposure occurring only when humans come into contact with infected fleas from dying rodents. The mechanism of transmission to humans was not understood in the 14th century. The germ theory of disease would not be developed until the 19th century, but the connection between rats and plague was observed and recorded by medieval chroniclers who noted that large numbers of rats died before human plague outbreaks began. The disease presents in three main forms. Bubonic plague, the most common form, occurs when the bacterium is transmitted by flea bite, travels to the lymph nodes, and causes the characteristic buboes, swollen, painful, blackened lymph nodes in the armpits, groin, and neck. Septicemic plague occurs when the bacterium enters the bloodstream directly, causing rapid systemic infection, often fatal within hours. Pneumonic plague occurs when the bacterium infects the lungs, causing a form of plague pneumonia that is transmitted person to person through respiratory droplets and is almost universally fatal without treatment. All three forms were probably present during the Black Death. The bubonic form was the most common and gave the pandemic its distinctive physical signature. The pneumonic form may have been responsible for the extraordinary speed of spread in some regions. A form of plague that spread through the air, without requiring the flea vector, would have been far more contagious than the standard bubonic form. The geographic spread of the Black Death across Europe between 1347 and 1353 is one of the most carefully documented events in medieval history, and the map of its progression reveals both the predictability of epidemic spread and its terrible efficiency. From Sicily, the plague moved to the Italian mainland in late 1347 and early 1348. It reached Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and Florence within months. Florence, one of the most densely populated and economically sophisticated cities in Europe, was devastated. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the Florence plague and wrote about it in the introduction to his Decameron, described a city in which the normal structures of society had collapsed entirely, in which the dead were piled in the streets because there was no one left to bury them, in which people had abandoned their sick family members and fled to the countryside. From the Italian cities, the plague spread along the trade routes, north through the Alpine passes to Germany and the Low Countries, west along the Mediterranean coast to Provence and Spain, north along the Atlantic coast to France and England. The English port of Weymouth received the first English cases in the summer of 1348. Within a year, the plague had reached Scotland and Ireland. The speed of spread was not uniform. The plague moved fastest through densely populated urban areas and along major trade routes, where human and rat populations were concentrated and where the conditions for rapid transmission were optimal. Rural areas were affected more slowly, and some communities, isolated villages, areas with low population density, were spared altogether, at least in the first wave. But the overall picture is one of a disease that moved across an entire continent with a relentlessness that overwhelmed every human attempt to contain it. Imagine waking one morning with a swelling in your armpit. It is the size of an egg. It is hard and painful when you touch it. You have a fever, not a mild fever, but the kind that makes the world seem strange, that makes the familiar shapes of your room look wrong, that makes your mouth dry and your thoughts confused. You have been healthy yesterday. You are dying today. The progression of bubonic plague, once symptoms appear, is rapid. The buboes grow larger and more painful over 2 to 3 days. The fever intensifies. Many victims experience hemorrhaging under the skin, the small blood vessels bursting, leaving dark patches that give the disease one of its names, the Black Death, the black bruises of subcutaneous bleeding spreading across the skin. Some victims vomited blood. Most were in severe pain. The case fatality rate for untreated bubonic plague is approximately 30 to 60%, which means that a substantial minority of those infected survived. Survivors were often left with permanent damage to the lymph nodes, to other organs, but they did survive, and they appear to have acquired some degree of immunity to subsequent exposure. The pneumonic form was far more lethal. Without treatment, pneumonic plague kills nearly 100% of those it infects. And the speed of death from pneumonic plague could be extraordinary. Witnesses described people who were alive and apparently healthy in the morning and dead by evening. This aspect of the disease, its ability to kill with almost no warning, was one of the most psychologically destabilizing features of the pandemic. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Europe's population before the Black Death was approximately 75 million people. The most carefully calibrated modern estimates suggest that between 25 and 50 million people died in the initial pandemic wave between 1347 and 1353, roughly 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population. At the upper end of the estimates, the Black Death killed more people in 5 years than the Second World War killed in 6, and the Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history. The regional variation was enormous. Some areas lost 1/4 of their population. Others lost 3/4. England may have lost approximately half its population. Florence lost perhaps 60%. Some smaller communities were entirely extinguished, every single person dead, the community's name surviving only in the records of neighboring parishes. Burying the dead became impossible in the worst affected areas. Mass graves were dug, the plague pits that archaeologists have been finding and excavating in European cities for the past few decades, telling us with the language of bones what the chronicles tell us with words. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piled in the streets, thrown into rivers, left in houses where entire families had died and where no neighbors remained to clear them. The psychological effect of watching everyone around you die, of not knowing who would be next, of the complete unpredictability of survival, was as devastating, in its way, as the physical death toll. Medieval society had structures for managing death, the church, with its rituals and its comfort, its promise of meaning and afterlife. The Black Death overwhelmed those structures. The church lost more than 1/3 of its clergy, in some areas more than half. There were not enough priests to give last rites to the dying. There were not enough gravediggers to bury the dead. The normal machinery of mortality stopped functioning. The initial pandemic wave ended, roughly, around 1353. The plague did not disappear, it never disappeared, but the initial, catastrophic outbreak subsided as the most susceptible individuals died, as communities developed some immunity, as the rat populations that served as the reservoir were also devastated. But the plague returned. It returned in 1361, a second wave that killed significant numbers of people, though not as many as the first, partly because those who had survived the first wave had some immunity. It returned again in the 1370s, in the 1380s, in the 1390s. For the next 3 centuries, bubonic plague was an endemic presence in European life, striking periodically, killing in the tens or hundreds of thousands each time, receding, returning. The last major European outbreak was the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly 1/4 of the city's population. After that, the plague gradually retreated from Western Europe, though it continued to affect other parts of the world and remains present today. The endemic presence of plague over 3 centuries after the initial pandemic left a permanent mark on European culture and psychology, a background awareness of sudden death, of the fragility of existence, of the possibility that tomorrow you might wake with a swelling in your armpit and be dead by the week's end. The ships are in the harbor. The smell has reached the docks. The harbor master is deciding what to do. In the streets above the harbor, in the markets and the churches and the houses of Messina, people are going about their lives. They do not know yet. In Part 2, we look more closely at what the plague did to the body, to the family, to the community, to the structures of medieval society that had seemed permanent. Rest here. Let the harbor settle around you. The ships are in the harbor. It is too late. What the plague did. Let me tell you about a town called Iam. Iam is a village in Derbyshire, in the north of England. It does not have a direct connection to the Black Death of 1347. Its story belongs to the plague of 1665, the last major English outbreak. But it illustrates, with unusual clarity and completeness, what plague does to a community, and it provides a kind of case study for the experience that was repeated, less documented but equally devastating, in thousands of communities across 14th-century Europe. In September 1665, a tailor in Iam received a box of cloth from London. The cloth was infested with plague-carrying fleas. The tailor's assistant opened the box and was dead within a week. Over the following months, the plague spread through the village. The rector of Iam, William Mompesson, made a decision that has been celebrated ever since. He persuaded the villagers to quarantine themselves, to seal the village against the outside world, to prevent the plague from spreading to neighboring communities. The villagers agreed. They remained in the village while the plague ran its course. Of approximately 350 people in Iam at the start of the outbreak, approximately 260 died. The quarantine worked, the surrounding villages were spared. The village as a whole survived, though barely. What happened in Iam happened, in various forms, in thousands of communities across the century and a half of European plague. The specific details differed. The essential structure was the same. A disease arrived, people died, the survivors tried to cope, and the community that emerged on the other side was permanently changed. The experience of dying from bubonic plague was not private. In a medieval house, a typically small, typically overcrowded dwelling where multiple family members shared beds and rooms, there was nowhere for the sick to be isolated, nowhere for the dying to die in peace. When one member of a household was infected, the others were immediately at risk. The flea that had bitten the infected person was still in the house, still looking for new hosts. The bacterium that had colonized the first victim's lymph nodes might already be incubating in another member of the family. Contemporary accounts describe families in which everyone sickened within days of each other, parents and children and servants all dying within the same week, the survivors, if any, unable to care for the dying because they were dying themselves. Boccaccio describes a scene in which two pigs rooted around a bundle of rags left in the street by a recently dead man ate something from the rags, and were dead within hours. The bacterium was everywhere, in the bedding, in the clothing, in the flea-infested bodies of the dying. What did it feel like to know you were dying of plague? The sources give us fragments. Some dying people expressed terror. Some expressed resignation, a stoic acceptance of what they recognized as inevitable. Some expressed rage at the randomness of it, the seeming indifference of God. Some experienced the delirious consolations of high fever, visions, voices, a confusion that may have been mercy. The priests who attended the dying, those who had not themselves fled or died, administered the last rites to such numbers that the ritual became abbreviated, rushed, performed at a distance. Some clergy refused to approach the dying at all, recognizing that exposure to the dying meant death for the priest. The church that had promised comfort in the face of death found itself unable to provide that comfort, overwhelmed by the scale of what was being asked of it. Medieval medicine had no understanding of the bacterium that was killing its patients, and its responses to the plague were consequently ineffective or actively harmful. The dominant medical theory of the era was miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by bad air, by the corrupted atmosphere that arose from rotting matter, standing water, and the presence of the sick and the dead. The recommended responses to miasmatic disease included burning aromatic herbs and woods to purify the air, carrying posies of flowers to protect against the smell, and avoiding the areas where the sick were concentrated. None of this worked against Yersinia pestis. The aromatic herbs had no effect on the bacterium. The flowers provided no protection. The only behavior that actually reduced transmission, avoiding contact with infected individuals and their environments, was recommended for the wrong reasons and practiced inconsistently. Bloodletting, the standard medical treatment for most serious illness, was applied to plague patients and almost certainly made some of them worse, further weakening already debilitated patients. Lancing the buboes, cutting them open to drain them, was practiced and may have provided some relief in cases where it was done cleanly, but it also spread the bacterium through the hands and instruments of those who performed it. The physicians who treated plague patients were at extreme personal risk. Many died. Those who survived often did so by luck or by practices that happened to reduce their exposure, wearing protective clothing that, by chance, prevented flea bites, treating patients from a distance, washing their hands and instruments in wine or vinegar, which may have had some antimicrobial effect. The most effective response to plague, as European communities eventually learned, was quarantine, isolating the sick from the healthy, and isolating affected communities from those not yet reached. But even this knowledge, slowly accumulated through painful experience, was applied inconsistently and often too late. The Black Death was not just a medical crisis. It was a theological crisis, one of the most severe that European Christianity had ever faced. The question that the plague posed to medieval Christian theology was simple and devastating: why? Why was God allowing this? What had the people of Europe done to deserve the worst catastrophe in human history? What was the meaning of a God who permitted such suffering on such a scale? The theology of the time had several answers available. The plague was divine punishment for sin, the sins of individuals, the sins of society, the accumulated moral failures of a civilization. This explanation had the advantage of offering a response: repent, reform, do penance, and perhaps the punishment would end. The flagellant movement was the most extreme expression of this theology. Groups of men, sometimes thousands of them, traveled from town to town, publicly beating themselves with whips, drawing blood, performing dramatic rituals of penance before crowds of onlookers. They believed that by suffering voluntarily they could appease a God angered by human sin. Their performances attracted large crowds and considerable emotional intensity. The flagellants were eventually condemned by the Pope, partly because their theology was heterodox. The idea that human suffering could atone for sin was in tension with the Church's teaching about the role of the sacraments, and partly because their gatherings, in the middle of a pandemic, were almost certainly contributing to the spread of the disease. Other responses to the theological crisis were less dramatic but equally revealing. The production of plague art, images of death, of the dance of death, of skeletons leading popes and kings and peasants in an equal procession toward the grave, reflected a confrontation with mortality that the Black Death had forced on European culture. Death was everywhere, sudden and indiscriminate, and the art of the period recorded the psychological impact of living in its constant presence. One of the most terrible consequences of the Black Death was the wave of violence against Jewish communities that swept through Europe as the pandemic spread. Jewish communities in medieval Europe were already marginalized, restricted in their occupations, confined to specific areas, subject to legal disabilities and periodic persecution. When the plague arrived and people looked for an explanation, Jewish communities became targets. The accusation spread, moving from city to city ahead of the plague itself, that Jews had caused the pestilence by poisoning the wells. The accusation was entirely without foundation. Jews were dying of plague at the same rates as their Christian neighbors, in some areas, perhaps lower rates, because Jewish religious law mandated hand-washing and other hygiene practices that may have provided some protection against the bacterium's flea vector. But the desire for an explanation, for someone to blame, overrode the evidence. In city after city across Germany, France, and Switzerland, Jewish communities were attacked and killed, sometimes by mobs, sometimes by official sanction, sometimes by both. The massacres of 1348 and 1349 destroyed some of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. In Strasbourg, the same Strasbourg that would witness the dancing plague in 1518, approximately 900 Jews were burned alive in February 1349. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague and ordering that they be protected. The bull was ignored by most of those to whom it was directed. The massacres continued. The persecution of the Jews during the Black Death is one of the clearest examples of the scapegoating mechanism that operates in times of mass crisis, the human tendency, when faced with incomprehensible suffering, to identify a cause, to find someone to blame, to convert the terror of random catastrophe into the more manageable terror of an enemy who can be identified and destroyed. The Black Death killed so many people that the fundamental labor relationships of medieval European society were disrupted in ways that could not be reversed. Medieval European agriculture was organized around serfdom, the system in which peasant farmers were bound to the land of a lord, required to work the lord's fields in exchange for the right to work their own, unable to move or change their condition without the lord's permission. The system worked, or rather, it endured, because the supply of labor was sufficient that lords had no need to compete for workers. Peasants had no alternative. The Black Death changed the calculation overnight. When half the population was dead, the surviving peasants found themselves in a position they had never occupied before. They were scarce. A lord with 100 acres of land and 10 surviving peasants to work it could not afford to lose any of them to a neighbor who offered better terms. The surviving peasants, recognizing their new leverage, began to demand better conditions, higher wages, reduction of feudal obligations, freedom to move. The lords resisted. They persuaded governments to pass laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding peasants to move, attempting to reimpose the old order by legal compulsion. But the attempt to legislate away economic reality could not succeed indefinitely. Over the following decades, serfdom in England gradually collapsed, not in a single dramatic event, but in the slow accretion of individual negotiations and small victories by workers who now had leverage they had never had before. This is one of the great ironies of the Black Death, the catastrophe that killed half of Europe's population also, in the long run, improved the lives of those who survived it. The survivors had more land, more leverage, more bargaining power than any previous generation of European peasants. The wages they eventually won, the freedoms they eventually gained, were purchased with the deaths of their neighbors. One of the less discussed consequences of the Black Death is the loss of accumulated knowledge and expertise that occurred when skilled practitioners died in large numbers. Medieval European society was built on craft traditions, specialized knowledge of how to make things, how to do things, how to manage specific tasks and processes, that lived not in books but in the minds and hands of practitioners. The master craftsman trained the apprentice, who trained the next apprentice, in a chain of transmission that was the primary mechanism of technological and practical knowledge transfer. When the plague killed a third to half of a population, it killed many of those practitioners. The chain of transmission was broken in thousands of crafts and skills simultaneously. When the survivors tried to rebuild, they found that knowledge had been lost, techniques for working certain metals, methods of constructing certain types of building, approaches to cultivating certain crops that had been standard practice before the plague were gone because the people who knew them were dead. The recovery of this knowledge took generations. Some of it was never fully recovered. The written records that have allowed modern historians to reconstruct so much of the medieval world are more extensive for the post-plague period than for the pre-plague period, partly because the plague disrupted the transmission of practical knowledge in ways that made writing it down seem more urgent. The dying is slowing. In the worst affected cities, the streets are quieter now, not because the plague is over, but because so many of those who would have filled them are gone. The markets are smaller. The churches are emptier. The fields are untended. The world that existed before October 1347 is gone. What will come after is not yet visible. In Part 3, we look at the world the plague destroyed, the world of the High Middle Ages, the civilization that was reaching its peak when the ships arrived in Messina. Rest here. The streets are quiet. They will fill again, eventually. But they will never be the same streets. The world it destroyed. There was a world before the Black Death. It is easy to forget this, because the world before the Black Death is less well known to us than the world after. The High Middle Ages, the 12th and 13th centuries, the era of the great cathedrals, of the universities, of the Crusades, of the development of towns and commerce, and the slow, irregular expansion of what we would recognize as European civilization, was a world that, in the century before the plague, was developing in ways that suggested the possibility of a different future. The population of Europe had been growing for centuries. Towns were becoming cities. Trade was expanding. The intellectual life of the universities, theology, philosophy, the slow accumulation of what would eventually become science, was more sophisticated and more widely practiced than it had been in the centuries after the fall of Rome. The cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries, Chartres, Notre Dame, Salisbury, were expressions of a civilization that was, by its own lights, reaching toward something higher. The Black Death interrupted this trajectory. Not permanently, the Renaissance would come, and the scientific revolution, and eventually modernity. But the specific world that the plague found in 1347, the world of the medieval commune, the guild, the monastery, the feudal manor, was changed so profoundly that it could not be described as continuous with what came after. The medieval city was a place that the Black Death was designed, almost perfectly, to destroy. The cities of 14th century Europe were dense, crowded, and filthy by modern standards. The concept of urban sanitation, the systematic removal of waste, the provision of clean water, the management of the animals that lived alongside humans in every city, was not absent but was entirely inadequate for the populations that the cities contained. The streets were shared by humans, horses, pigs, chickens, and rats in a promiscuity of species that created optimal conditions for the transmission of diseases that could cross between them. The housing was crowded, multiple families sharing single rooms in the poorest districts, with the animals sometimes sharing the same space. The markets were open-air congregations of people and goods from across the city and the surrounding region. The churches were weekly gatherings of everyone in the parish. The inns were meeting places for travelers from distant parts. Every social institution of the medieval city was a mechanism for bringing people into close contact, which was, in the context of a flea-transmitted disease, a mechanism for maximizing exposure. The cities suffered worst. Florence, which had perhaps 100,000 people before the plague, had perhaps 50,000 afterward. The recovery took more than a century. Some cities never fully recovered, their populations remaining below pre-plague levels for generations. The effect on urban economies was dramatic. The specialized labor of the medieval city, the weavers, the dyers, the metalworkers, the merchants, the lawyers, the physicians, was devastated. The supply chains that connected the cities to each other and to the rural hinterland were disrupted. The markets that had been the engines of the medieval commercial economy shrank or ceased. The Black Death was a crisis of institutional legitimacy for the Catholic Church from which it never fully recovered. This is a strong claim, and it requires some explanation. The Church did not collapse during or after the plague. It continued to function, to accumulate wealth and power, to exercise authority over the religious life of European Christians. The institutional church of the 15th century was in many ways as powerful as the church of the 13th. But the plague revealed, with brutal clarity, the gap between the church's claims and its capabilities. The church claimed to be the mediator between God and humanity, the institution through which divine grace flowed into the world. If God had sent the plague as a punishment, the Church should have been able to intercede, to perform the rituals that would turn away divine wrath, to provide the spiritual resources that would allow Christians to understand and endure their suffering. The Church could not do this. Its rituals did not stop the plague. Its intercessory prayers were not answered. Its clergy died alongside everyone else, in some areas, at higher rates, because their role required them to attend the dying. The priests who remained fled or died. The sacraments were not available to many of the dying. The Church was present in the middle of the catastrophe, performing its functions as best it could, and it was not enough. This failure of institutional Christianity did not immediately produce the Reformation, that was still a century and a half away. But it planted a seed of doubt, a questioning of whether the Church's claims to be the necessary intermediary between God and humanity were warranted, that would grow over the following generations. The mystical movements of the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Devotio Moderna, the Lollards, the Hussites, all expressed, in different ways, a desire for a more direct, less mediated relationship with God that the Black Death had made thinkable. The culture of death that the Black Death produced was one of the most distinctive and lasting contributions of the pandemic to European civilization. The danse macabre, the dance of death, is a motif that appears in art and literature across late medieval Europe, in which death personified leads figures from all walks of life, pope and emperor, knight and peasant, merchant and monk, in a procession toward the grave. The motif expressed something specific to the post-plague experience, the recognition that death was universal and indiscriminate, that the social hierarchies that organized medieval life were meaningless in the face of the grave, that the plague had been no respecter of rank or virtue. The danse macabre was a democratizing image, in its dark way. The Pope danced with the peasant. The king danced with the beggar. The plague had shown that this was true, that the mortality rate in the royal courts and noble households was not significantly different from the mortality rate in the poorest quarters of the city. The art of the late 14th century is marked by this preoccupation with death and decay. The transi tombs, the tombs in which the effigy of the deceased is shown not in the idealized form of a sleeping noble but as a rotting corpse, the skin blackened, the flesh consumed, appear in this period, representing a confrontation with physical mortality that earlier medieval art had generally avoided. This engagement with death was not despair. It was, in a complicated way, a kind of honesty, a refusal of the consolations that had previously softened the awareness of mortality, an insistence on looking at what death actually was. The Black Death was a catastrophic failure for medieval medicine, and it knew it. The physicians who survived the plague, and many did not, had to reckon with the fact that everything they had done had been useless. The bleedings and the purges and the aromatic herbs and the dietary advice had not saved their patients. The miasma theory that underpinned their practice had not provided them with effective tools against the disease. Some physicians responded to this failure by doubling down, insisting that the theory was correct and that the problem was with the application, not the framework. Others began to question the theoretical foundations of their practice more fundamentally. The slow, centuries-long process by which medieval miasma theory gave way to early modern empiricism, the preference for observation over authority, for what the physician could see and measure over what the ancient texts prescribed, was accelerated by the experience of the plague. The development of public health institutions in Italian cities in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was a direct response to the plague's lessons. The first plague hospitals, lazarettos, were established in Venice and other Italian cities. The first systematic quarantine laws were enacted. The first attempts to track and respond to epidemic disease as a public, collective problem rather than an individual medical one were made. These institutions were primitive by modern standards. But they represented the beginning of a tradition, public health as a governmental responsibility, epidemic disease as something that could be managed through coordinated social action, that would eventually develop into modern epidemiology. The economic consequences of the Black Death were as profound as its demographic ones, and they shaped the development of European capitalism in ways that are still debated by historians. The immediate economic effects were devastating. The collapse of population meant the collapse of demand, fewer people to buy goods, fewer workers to make them, fewer merchants to trade them. The commercial networks that had been expanding throughout the 13th century contracted sharply. Some trades disappeared entirely for decades. But the longer-term effects were more complicated. The labor shortage that followed the initial mortality gave surviving workers bargaining power they had never had. Wages rose, despite the laws attempting to prevent this. The feudal obligations that had bound peasants to the land became harder to enforce. The economic relationships of medieval Europe were renegotiated, slowly and painfully, in the decades after the plague. The survivors also inherited land and capital from the dead. A peasant family that had owned one small plot before the plague might find itself, after the deaths of parents and siblings and neighbors, with multiple plots, with animals and tools and accumulated resources. This concentration of property among the survivors created, in some areas, a more prosperous peasant class than had existed before, a class with enough surplus to invest, to improve their land, to enter the market economy as buyers and sellers rather than merely as subsistence farmers. These economic changes, the rise of wages, the collapse of serfdom, the emergence of a more prosperous peasantry, were not immediate or uniform. They took decades to work through, and they were contested at every step. But they laid some of the material foundations for the economic development of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Black Death left a psychological legacy that persisted in European culture for centuries. The awareness of sudden death, of the possibility that a healthy person could be dead within days, without warning, without apparent cause, became a permanent feature of the European psychological landscape after 1347. The memento mori tradition, the skull on the scholar's desk, the reminder in art and literature that we are mortal, was not invented by the plague, but it was intensified and given a specific urgency by the plague experience. This intensification of mortality awareness had cultural consequences that are difficult to measure but clearly real. The art of the late 14th and 15th centuries is saturated with death, not just in the danse macabre but in the landscape of late medieval devotional practice, in the preoccupation with purgatory and indulgences and the exact conditions of the afterlife. These concerns were present before the plague, but the plague made them urgent in a new way. There was also something else, something that the historians who study the late medieval period describe as a kind of reckless vitality, a carpe diem energy that emerged alongside the preoccupation with death. If the plague could take you at any moment, why not live fully now? The 14th and 15th centuries were periods of extraordinary creative and intellectual energy alongside the death consciousness, the literature of Chaucer and Boccaccio and Petrarch, the music, the art, the philosophy. The proximity of death was, for some, a spur to life. The world that existed before October 1347 is gone. The Florence of Dante, the city of 100,000 people, of the wool trade and the banking houses and the extraordinary cultural flowering of the late 13th century, is gone. The feudal order, already weakening before the plague, will not survive the century. The church that claimed to be the universal mediator of divine grace has been shown, in the most vivid way possible, that it cannot fulfill that claim. But people are still alive. Half of them, or a third of them, or 2/3 of them, depending on where they lived and how lucky they were. They are alive in a world that is emptier and stranger and more precarious than the one they were born into. In Part 4, we ask what came next, what the survivors made of the world the plague had left them, and why the catastrophe that killed half of Europe may have been the event that made the modern world. Rest here. The streets are quieter than they were. They will fill again. The world it made. This is the strangest thing about the Black Death. It was the worst catastrophe in human history, the event that killed more people, more quickly, more completely, than any other single event before or since. It killed half of Europe. It killed a third of the Middle East. It killed populations in Central Asia and China that we can only estimate because the records are so incomplete. It is, by any measure of suffering, the worst thing that has ever happened to the human species. And it may have been the event that made the modern world possible. This is not a comfortable idea. It feels indecent to suggest that something good came from so much death, that the bodies in the plague pit somehow purchased the freedoms and the technologies and the cultural achievements that followed. It feels like an insult to the dead, to the people who died in agony, to the families that were extinguished, to the communities that ceased to exist. And yet the historical connection is real. The world that existed before the Black Death, the world of feudalism and ecclesiastical authority, of a fixed social hierarchy and a theological framework that explained suffering as divine will, was, in important ways, the world that the Renaissance and the Reformation and eventually the scientific revolution dismantled. And the Black Death was one of the forces that made the dismantling possible. The immediate economic consequence of the Black Death, the labor shortage, the rise in wages, the collapse of serfdom, had long-term implications that extend far beyond the medieval economy. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the average English agricultural laborer was earning more, in real terms, than at any point before or after until the Industrial Revolution. The land that had previously been the exclusive property of the aristocracy and the church was being redistributed, through purchase, through inheritance, through the slow workings of a market that the plague had made more fluid. A new class of relatively prosperous small landowners was emerging, the yeomanry of England, the prosperous peasantry of France, who had disposable income, consumer preferences, and political interests that had not existed before the plague. This new class was, among other things, a market for books. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in the 1440s, was a revolutionary technology, but revolutionary technologies require markets to be revolutionary. The market for books that the printing press found and served was created, in part, by the economic changes that the plague had set in motion. A literate, economically secure class of people who could afford books and had the time and inclination to read them was the precondition for the information revolution that the printing press produced. The printing press, in turn, was the precondition for the Reformation. Martin Luther's challenge to the Church depended on the ability to distribute his arguments widely and quickly, to create a mass readership that could engage with the theological debate. Without printing, the Reformation might have been contained as previous challenges to the Church had been contained. With printing, it became unstoppable. The chain of consequences is not linear and not inevitable. But the plague sits, somewhere back in the chain, as one of the conditions that made what followed possible. The Italian Renaissance, the extraordinary flowering of art, literature, philosophy, and science that began in the Italian city-states in the late 14th century and reached its peak in the 15th and 16th, has many causes and many preconditions. Among them is the Black Death. The plague killed about half of Florence's population. It also, by killing so many people so quickly, dramatically accelerated the concentration of wealth among survivors. The Medici family, the bankers and patrons who funded so much of the Renaissance, accumulated their wealth in the generation after the plague, in part because so many of their competitors and predecessors were dead. The cultural patronage that made the Renaissance possible required the concentrated wealth that the plague had helped to create. The Renaissance humanists, the scholars who turned from the theological preoccupations of medieval philosophy toward the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts, toward the celebration of human capacity and human beauty, were working in a cultural context that the plague had shaped. The confrontation with mass death had not destroyed the capacity for joy or beauty or intellectual ambition, it had, in some ways, intensified them. The carpe diem energy of the Renaissance, the celebration of the present moment, the glorification of the human body, the delight in the physical world, was partly a response to the awareness of mortality that the plague had seared into European culture. Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, 170 years after the Black Death reached Europe. The connection between the two events is not direct. But the ground for Luther's challenge to the Church had been prepared, in part, by what the plague had done to the Church's authority and credibility. The Church that failed its flock during the Black Death, that lost so many of its clergy, that could not provide the sacraments to the dying, that could not explain why God was permitting such suffering, that could not stop the catastrophe, was a church that had been shown to have limits. The theological reassurance it offered was not adequate to the experience people were living through. In the century and a half between the plague and Luther, this inadequacy expressed itself in a series of reform movements, Wycliffe in England, Hus in Bohemia, the Devotio Moderna in the Low Countries, that challenged various aspects of the Church's authority and practice. These movements were suppressed, but the underlying demand for a more authentic, less corrupt, more directly accessible faith could not be permanently contained. Luther's challenge succeeded, in part, because it found a readership that was already prepared to receive it, a literate public that had been cultivating doubts about the Church's claims for a century and a half, that had been watching the Church fail to reform itself, that was ready to hear someone say plainly that the Emperor had no clothes. The Black Death did not cause the Reformation, but it helped create the conditions in which the Reformation was possible. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, the development of the empirical method, the mathematical description of natural phenomena, the systematic observation and experiment that produced the work of Galileo and Kepler and Newton, has complex intellectual roots. Among those roots is the medical failure of the Black Death. Medieval medicine had failed spectacularly and visibly against the plague. The theoretical framework that medicine had inherited from ancient Greek sources, the theory of humors, the miasma theory of disease, had provided no effective tools against Yersinia pestis. This failure was not lost on those who survived. The questioning of ancient authority, the preference for observation over received doctrine, the willingness to test claims against experience, these intellectual habits were strengthened by the evidence of the plague that ancient theory did not always work. The anatomical revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries, the work of Vesalius and others who dissected human bodies and found that the ancient descriptions were wrong, that Galen had made mistakes, that the body was not quite what the text said it was part of the same intellectual movement. The plague had made it clear that medical theory needed to be tested against reality. The anatomists were doing exactly that testing. The development of public health institutions, quarantine laws, lazarettos, plague hospitals, the systematic tracking of epidemic disease, also contributed to the empirical tradition. These institutions required observation and record-keeping. How many people had died, where, when, of what? The statistical consciousness that would eventually produce modern epidemiology began, in a primitive way, with the attempts of Italian city-states to manage plague outbreaks in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The world we live in was built, in part, by the survivors of the Black Death. Not just in the abstract sense that all of us are descendants of those who survived, though that is true, and there is something worth dwelling on in the fact that every person alive today is descended from ancestors who lived through the worst pandemic in human history. But in the more specific sense that the social, economic, political, and intellectual arrangements of the modern world were shaped, in important ways, by the responses of the survivors to what had happened to them. The survivors demanded higher wages. They got them. Eventually, the labor movement that would eventually produce the 8-hour day and the minimum wage and the welfare state is connected, through a long chain of consequence, to the demands of the peasants who survived the Black Death and recognized their new leverage. The survivors questioned the church's authority. They found, eventually, new forms of religious life that were more adequate to their experience. The religious pluralism of the modern world, the existence of multiple Christian denominations, the separation of church and state, the principle of religious freedom, is connected, through the Reformation, to the questions that the plague forced on European Christianity. The survivors looked at their world empirically. They observed, they recorded, they tested. The scientific method that has produced the antibiotics that would have saved Lord Carnarvon's life, the vaccines that have prevented pandemics, the medical knowledge that has transformed the human experience of illness and death, all of this is connected to the empirical turn that the plague helped accelerate. The ships arrived in Messina in October 1347. In 5 years, half of Europe was dead. The streets were quiet. The fields were untended. The churches were empty of priests. The world that had existed before was gone. And then, slowly, the survivors began to build something new. They built it with the labor of their hands and the memory of their losses and the particular mixture of grief and determination and dark humor that characterizes people who have survived something that should not have been survivable. They built it with the leverage that death had given them, the leverage of scarcity, of being needed, of being the last one standing in a world that needed people to work it and trade in it and think about it. They built the Renaissance. They built the Reformation. They built the empirical method. They built, very slowly and very painfully and with many wrong turns and terrible injustices along the way, something that began to look like the modern world. We do not know most of their names. The survivors of the Black Death are anonymous to us, the peasants who negotiated their freedom, the merchants who rebuilt their businesses, the artists who depicted the dance of death and the physicians who began to observe rather than their eyes and the priests who kept faith in a God who had seemed to abandon them. They survived something unimaginable and they built something extraordinary. We are what they built. The ships arrived in Messina in October 1347. The world has never been the same. Good night.